My name is Grace Rodriguez. I'm 35 years old. And the year that shattered everything wasn't when I flew combat missions over hostile territory, or when I pulled wounded Marines out of a burning helicopter at 30,000 feet. It was the year I came home from the skies and opened Martinez Auto Repair in suburban Phoenix, watching my own family destroy me with their disappointment. A woman crawling under cars all day, my husband Mark announced at Sunday dinner, his voice carrying that particular mixture of embarrassment and disgust that had become our new normal. What kind of future is that? The agreement rippled through his family like poison. My mother-in-law set down her wine glass with theatrical precision, looking at me like I was something that had tracked mud across her Persian rug. "This house needs a proper woman," she declared, her words hitting harder than ground fire, not someone wasting her life on manual labor. I sat there with grease still embedded under my fingernails, wearing my only clean blouse, carrying secrets about classified missions that would have made their suburban complaints seem pathetically small. They saw oil stains and thought that's all I was. They didn't know that every turn of a wrench kept me connected to the F-16 engines I'd once flown into battle. They thought they knew failure. They had no idea what victory looked like. The dining room felt like a courtroom where I'd been on trial for 8 months, and the verdict was always the same: guilty of refusing to be the woman they'd ordered from a catalog. Mark's mother had decorated the place like a shrine to suburban respectability. Floral wallpaper, china cabinet filled with wedding gifts we'd never used, family photos arranged to project the image of people who'd made all the right choices. Tonight's dinner was supposed to celebrate Mark's promotion to regional sales manager, but it had become another opportunity to dissect my failures as a wife. The table was set with her good dishes, the ones that only came out when she wanted to remind me that I wasn't worthy of them. Pot roast steamed on a serving platter while conversations flowed around me like water around a stone talk of neighborhood gossip, mortgage rates, and the kind of success that got measured in kitchen appliances and vacation photos. But I sat at the far end next to the kitchen door, still smelling faintly of motor oil despite 3 showers and enough industrial soap to strip paint. "Grace," my mother-in-law began, her voice carrying that particular tone of concerned disappointment she'd perfected over 8 years of explaining why I wasn't quite good enough for her son. "We need to talk about this hobby of yours." Hobby. The word landed like shrapnel, finding every vulnerable spot I'd thought I'd armored against their judgment. Around me, conversations stopped as the family tribunal prepared to deliver its latest assessment of my inadequacies. "A woman crawling under cars all day," she continued, cutting her pot roast with surgical precision, getting covered in grease and oil like some common laborer. What kind of future is that? The agreement was immediate and unanimous. Mark's brother Dave nodded sagely. His wife Linda murmured something about knowing your place, and his sister Sarah exchanged that look with her husband that said, "Thank God we don't have this problem." "You're 35, Grace," Mark added, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never been wrong about anything that mattered to suburban dinner conversations. "Grease stains and empty dreams, this isn't a future. I deserve better than a wife who smells like a gas station." Better. The word echoed through that dining room like gunfire, finding its target with precision that came from 8 months of practice. I gripped my fork tighter, feeling the calluses from wrench work that they saw as evidence of my failure to evolve into proper womanhood. "Some men marry women," Dave chimed in, probably thinking he was being clever. "Others marry mechanics." The laughter that followed wasn't cruel, it was worse. It was the kind of casual, dismissive amusement that people use when they're completely certain of their moral superiority. 8 people who shared DNA with my husband, all agreeing that their assessment of my worth was not only accurate but generous. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that every day I spent under the hood of a Honda Civic or Ford F-150, I was maintaining the connection to engines that had once carried me into combat zones where their suburban complaints would have seemed like luxury problems. The memory hit me like afterburner ignition. 3 years ago, flying an F-16 Fighting Falcon through Syrian airspace at Mach 1.2, my hands steady on controls that determined whether 6 Marine ground units lived or died. The roar of jet engines drowning out everything except mission-critical communications, while I coordinated airstrikes that prevented a terrorist cell from overrunning an American outpost. But there was no way to explain that at a dinner table in Phoenix without violating operational security protocols that had been drilled into me during years of classified training. No way to tell them that their failure of a daughter-in-law held clearances that most federal employees would never achieve. "This house needs a proper woman," my mother-in-law announced with the finality of a judge delivering sentence, "not someone wasting her life on manual labor." Manual labor. While she'd been arranging throw pillows and hosting book clubs, I'd been manually piloting aircraft through conditions that would have given her nightmares for decades. Mark stood then, moving to the liquor cabinet with the dramatic flair of someone preparing to deliver a speech that would be remembered by everyone except the person it was designed to destroy. "I've been thinking about this for months," he said, pouring himself 3 fingers of bourbon while 45 pairs of eyes turned toward him like flowers following sunlight. "Grace, this isn't working. This marriage, this. Whatever you've become. I want a divorce." The words hit that dining room like cluster munitions, precise and devastating. I watched faces around the table as they processed Mark's announcement, some shocked, others relieved, all of them certain that this was the inevitable conclusion to a failed experiment in matching their golden boy with damaged goods. "You're not worthy," he continued, warming to his theme while I sat there absorbing his assessment like incoming fire. "You're not the woman I married. You're not the woman any man would want to come home to. Not worthy." The phrase would have been funny if it didn't cut so deep. While Mark had been building his sales career in air-conditioned conference rooms, I'd been proving my worth in ways that couldn't be measured in quarterly earnings or suburban social currency. I looked at this man I'd shared a bed with for 8 years, who'd never bothered to ask what I'd done during my time away, who'd constructed an entire narrative about my failures based on the grease under my fingernails and the calluses on my palms. "You'll understand someday," I said quietly, my voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. Mark laughed, actually laughed like I'd just told the funniest joke he'd ever heard. "Understand what? That I married a woman who thinks changing oil is more important than being a wife?" The divorce papers were signed 3 weeks later. No tears, no begging, no dramatic confrontations, just signatures on legal documents that dissolved 8 years of marriage with the efficiency of a business transaction. As Mark packed his belongings, loading his BMW with clothes and electronics and the other accessories of his suburban success, I stood in the driveway of the house we'd bought together, watching him prepare to drive toward what he was certain would be a better future. "This is a mistake you'll regret," he said, his final words carrying the authority of someone who'd never been wrong about anything important. I didn't argue, didn't explain, just watched him drive away while carrying secrets that would have redefined his understanding of worth, service, and what it actually meant to fight for something bigger than mortgage payments and neighborhood approval. 3 months later, everything would change. 3 months later, the truth would come roaring out of the sky with afterburners lit and landing gear extended. But that night, I was just Grace, the failed wife, the disappointing daughter-in-law, the woman who'd chosen grease stains over respectability. Tomorrow would tell a very different story. The garage smelled like motor oil and broken dreams. Martinez Auto Repair sat wedged between a laundromat and a pawn shop, on the kind of street where people brought their cars when they couldn't afford the dealership, where hope came measured in $50 fixes and payment plans that stretched over 3 months. I'd bought the place with my military separation pay, 800 square feet of concrete floor, hydraulic lifts that wheezed like old men, and a hand-painted sign that the previous owner had left behind. Every morning at 6 a.m., I rolled up the metal door and stepped into a world that measured success in carburetors cleaned and transmissions rebuilt. The neighborhood had its rhythm. Kids rode past on bikes, pointing and giggling. "Look, a lady mechanic." Their laughter echoed off brick walls while I slid under a 2003 Honda Accord, checking for oil leaks that its owner couldn't afford to ignore much longer. By noon, the curious looks would turn to whispers. Men walking past on their lunch breaks, shaking their heads with the kind of disappointment usually reserved for watching someone waste obvious potential. "What a waste," I heard one tell his buddy, their voices carrying clearly through the open bay doors. "Pretty woman like that, covered in grease all day. Should be home raising kids, not pretending to be a man." Pretending to be a man. While they'd been pretending to understand what real work looked like, the Chevy Silverado I was working on had seen better decades. Its owner, Mrs. Patterson from 3 blocks down, had brought it in with transmission problems she couldn't afford to fix anywhere else. She was a widow living on Social Security, choosing between car repairs and prescription medications. I could have charged her $800 and sent her to a dealership. Instead, I quoted her $250 and a promise that I'd make it run like it was 10 years younger. "You sure you know what you're doing, honey?" she'd asked, not unkindly but with the concern of someone who'd lived long enough to know that not everyone could deliver on their promises. I'd just smiled and popped the hood, letting the engine tell me its story through the language of worn gaskets and tired pistons. Some conversations don't require words. The apartment above the garage was where I went when the day ended, and the metal door rolled down with the finality of a curtain falling on a one-woman show. Concrete steps led to a space that would have been generous for a college dorm kitchenette, bathroom with a shower that ran hot when the building's temperamental water heater cooperated, and a living room furnished with whatever the previous tenant had left behind. Most nights, I ate microwaved leftovers while sitting on a couch that had seen better decades, watching the local news that never seemed to cover anything beyond traffic accidents and city council meetings. The kind of programming designed for people whose biggest daily adventure was choosing between brands of breakfast cereal. But in the corner, sitting on a shelf I'd built from cinder blocks and salvaged lumber, was the reason I could endure every dismissive look and condescending comment. My flight helmet. Matte black with scratches that told stories I couldn't share, reflecting light from the single overhead bulb like a talisman from another life. Some nights I'd hold it, feeling the weight of missions that had required split-second decisions with international consequences, remembering what it felt like to push an F-16 through clouds at 600 miles per hour while coordinating airstrikes that saved American lives. The memory always hit the same way, sudden and complete, like afterburner ignition. 3 months ago, flying combat air patrol over Syrian airspace while insurgents attempted to overrun a forward operating base. My squadron had been vectored in with 8 minutes to prevent what intelligence called a catastrophic loss of American personnel. 8 minutes to coordinate with ground forces, identify targets, and deliver ordnance with precision that meant the difference between mission success and international incident. I'd made the call, authorized the strike, watched through my targeting system as terrorists who'd been preparing to execute captured Marines simply stopped existing. 16 Americans went home to their families because of decisions I'd made in a cockpit 200 miles from where Mrs. Patterson was now worried about her transmission. But there was no way to explain that to neighbors who saw grease stains and assumed failure. No way to tell them that every bolt I tightened, every engine I rebuilt, was maintaining the connection to machinery that had once carried me into combat zones where their suburban complaints would have seemed like abstract philosophy. Dad's voice echoed in the silence of that apartment, as clear as if he were standing beside me. "Mija, you were born to fly. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." He died 2 years before I'd earned my wings. Never got to see his daughter climb into a fighter jet and disappear into skies he'd only dreamed about. But his words had carried me through flight training that broke men who'd assumed they were stronger, through missions that tested limits most people couldn't imagine. They thought I'd fallen, I whispered to the empty room, holding that helmet like a promise I'd made to a dead man. But the truth was, I was still flying, just not where they could see. The neighborhood slept around me, 60,000 people who had no idea that their failed mechanic had prevented terrorist attacks that would have dominated headlines for decades. Who measured worth in wedding rings and corporate positions while their defender lived above an auto shop, maintaining her connection to purpose through the meditation of internal combustion engines? Tomorrow would bring more Hondas with transmission problems, more Fords with timing belt issues, more opportunities to serve people who would never know that their mechanic had once served her country at altitudes where the sky turned black and Earth curved away beneath her wings. But in 3 months, everything would change. In 3 months, the truth would come roaring out of the Arizona sky with landing gear extended and afterburners lit, carrying vindication that would shatter every assumption they'd made about what failure looked like. Tonight, though, I was just Grace, the divorce mechanic, the disappointment, the woman who'd chosen grease stains over respectability. Tomorrow would tell the same story. But not forever. 3 months after the divorce papers were signed, I got a call that would change everything. Major Rodriguez, the voice on my phone was crisp, military. "We need you at Luke Air Force Base next Friday. Commemorative ceremony for Operation Desert Thunder. Full dress uniform. Operation Desert Thunder." The mission that had made headlines for exactly 12 hours before being classified beyond public access. The mission where my squadron had prevented what would have been the deadest terrorist attack on American soil since 9/11. I hung up the phone and stared at my reflection in the garage's cracked mirror grease under my nails, oil stain on my coveralls, hair pulled back in a ponytail that had seen better days. In 1 week, I'd be standing on a stage where my double life would finally collide with reality. Friday morning arrived with Arizona sunshine that made the concrete tarmac shimmer like water. Luke Air Force Base sprawled across the desert like a monument to American air power hangars big enough to house commercial aircraft, runways that stretched toward mountains, and the kind of precision that comes from defending the most powerful nation on Earth. The ceremony was set up on the main tarmac, with bleachers facing a stage decorated in red, white, and blue bunting. 500 invited guests filled folding chairs, while military personnel stood at attention in formations that had been practiced until they achieved perfection. I spotted them in the third row before they saw me Mark in his best suit, looking around with the kind of casual interest that came from attending social events where he didn't know anyone important. His mother beside him, wearing pearls and the expression of someone enduring military pageantry for the sake of family obligations. They were there because Mark's cousin Steve was receiving a commendation for his service in Afghanistan, a staff sergeant who'd never seen combat but had managed logistics with the kind of competence that kept wars running smoothly. Good work, honorable work, but not the kind that made headlines or required congressional briefings. As the ceremony began, I watched from the pilot's ready room inside Hangar 3, adjusting my flight suit and running through pre-flight checks that had become as automatic as breathing. Through the small window, I could see the crowd settling into their seats while a military band played patriotic standards that echoed across the desert. That's when the announcement crackled through the public address system, cutting through conversations like thunder rolling across mountains. Ladies and gentlemen, we now present a special demonstration by one of our finest combat pilots, fresh from classified operations in defense of American interests abroad. The crowd looked up expectantly, shielding their eyes against the Arizona sun as they scanned empty skies for whatever was about to appear. Mark checked his watch with the impatience of someone who had better places to be. Then they heard the distant rumble of afterburners that started as whisper and built to roar. My F-16 appeared as a speck against the blue, growing larger and louder until it filled the entire sky with sound that made hearts pound and windows rattle. I banked hard left, pulling 4 Gs while the crowd below became a blur of upturned faces and pointing fingers. The jet responded like an extension of my will, turning physics into poetry through precise application of thrust vectoring and aerodynamic control. At 200 feet, I screamed over the ceremony at 400 miles per hour, the sonic boom trailing behind like punctuation on a sentence written in jet exhaust. Then vertical climb to 3,000 feet, aileron roll for dramatic effect, and approach vector for landing that would bring me down exactly where the crowd could see everything. Touchdown was perfect main gear, kissing asphalt with the precision that comes from years of carrier landings and combat field operations. I taxied toward the ceremony, canopy already opening while ground crew guided me to the designated spot 50 yards from the bleachers. The silence that followed engine shutdown was absolute. 500 people holding their breath while I climbed down from the cockpit, flight helmet under my arm, walking toward a crowd that included my ex-husband and his family. That's when I removed my helmet. The gasp that rippled through those bleachers was audible even over the cooling jet engines. Mark's mouth fell open like a broken hinge. His mother's hand flew to her chest as if she'd been shot. Neighbors who'd whispered about the failed mechanic were now staring at a woman in military flight suit with captain's bars and wings that meant she'd achieved something most people couldn't imagine. Ladies and gentlemen, the base commander's voice filled the desert air with absolute authority. Captain Grace Rodriguez, call sign Wrench, leader of the 421st Fighter Squadron. Captain, call sign, squadron leader. Words that redefined everything they thought they knew about the woman who'd spent 3 months fixing their cars and absorbing their pity. The applause started with military personnel sharp, immediate, the kind of recognition that comes from understanding what those wings actually meant. Then civilians joined in, tentative at first, then building until it became something more than approval. As I walked toward the stage where General Martinez waited with a medal case, I could see faces in the crowd processing what they were witnessing. The failed wife was being honored by the United States Air Force. The wasted woman had just demonstrated capabilities that most fighter pilots trained their entire careers to achieve. Mark was shaking his head like he was trying to wake up from a dream that didn't make sense. His mother had tears streaming down her face, not from pride, but from the kind of regret that comes when you realize you've been catastrophically wrong about someone who mattered. But the most important face in that crowd belonged to Mrs. Patterson, the widow whose transmission I'd fixed for half price. She was standing in the back row, applauding with tears in her eyes, finally understanding why her mechanic had worked with the precision of someone who'd learned that mechanical failure could mean the difference between life and death. The truth had come roaring out of the Arizona sky with afterburners lit and landing gear extended, carrying vindication that would shatter every assumption they'd made about what failure looked like. And as I climbed those steps toward a medal that represented service they'd never understand, I carried Dad's voice with me. Mija, you were born to fly. Today, the whole world would finally see exactly how high I'd soared. The medal weighed more than any equipment I'd carried into combat. When General Martinez pinned the Distinguished Flying Cross to my chest, vindication finally settled over me like armor I'd been waiting 35 years to earn. Ladies and gentlemen, his voice carried across the tarmac, today we honor Captain Grace Rodriguez for extraordinary heroism in aerial combat. Now, Captain Rodriguez led her squadron through hostile airspace to neutralize a terrorist threat classified as imminent and catastrophic. Her tactical leadership prevented what would have been the deadliest attack on American civilians since September 11th. Furthermore, the general continued, Captain Rodriguez displayed exceptional valor when her wingman was shot down over enemy territory. She held off 12 hostile aircraft while coordinating a rescue that saved 2 American pilots. Then, 12 against 1. While they debated property values, I had been outnumbered 6-1 in an 18-minute dogfight that scattered enemy aircraft across the Syrian desert. Applause erupted from the military first immediate, thunderous before civilians joined in, hesitant at first, then swelling into a roar. Grace, Grace, Grace! The chant spread like wildfire. Neighbors who once whispered about my wasted life now shouted my name as if I'd won a championship. Mrs. Patterson, whose car I had repaired for half price, cried openly, clapping with hands twisted by arthritis. At last, she understood why I had worked with such precision, why every repair was flawless. They told me fixing engines was a waste of time, I began, making sure Mark and his family heard every word. They laughed when I dreamed of flying. They told me to be realistic, practical, normal. The crowd listened in silence, the kind reserved for moments that echo in history. But I kept a promise, I said, eyes on the empty space where Dad should have stood. A promise to my father, who taught me that honor isn't about what others think, but about what you do when nobody's watching. A promise to my country to stand between the innocent and those who would harm them. And a promise to myself to never let anyone convince me my dreams were too big for their understanding. Applause rolled like thunder, but I raised my hand for quiet. They said there was no future in crawling under cars, I continued, staring at Mark, who couldn't meet my eyes. But every engine I rebuilt kept me connected to the machines I once flew into combat. Every bolt I tightened trained me for the precision that saved American lives. Mark lowered his head further, his confidence gone. The man who demanded a proper wife now knew he had divorced someone who had protected his freedom while he slept safely in suburbia. Because there is no wasted work, I declared, voice cutting across the desert like a battle cry. Only wasted courage. And some of us are born to be brave enough to fly into darkness so others can live in the light. The standing ovation lasted 15 minutes. Soldiers saluted, civilians cheered, cameras flashed, strangers embraced. My name echoed across Luke Air Force Base like thunder announcing a storm. In my flight suit, metal gleaming, helmet under my arm like a hard-earned trophy, I understood the difference between approval and respect. Behind me sat a family who had been wrong for years. Before me stood a nation that finally understood. Above me stretched the endless sky, waiting for the next mission to test everything I had learned about courage, service, and the cost of keeping promises to the dead. The girl mocked at dinner tables had become the woman her country called a hero. And in the silence between applause and the roar of jet engines, that transformation felt like coming home. Dad's voice echoed in the desert wind. Mija, you were born to fly. Today, the world finally knew how high I had soared. Grace's story reminds us that worth isn't defined by other people's narrow vision, that service comes in many forms, and that the most extraordinary people often hide in plain sight doing ordinary work with extraordinary purpose. Follow for more stories of quiet heroes. Comment, subscribe for stories about people whose most important achievements happen when others aren't watching, whose strength shows up in unexpected places, whose worth can't be measured by conventional metrics. Share this story with someone who needs to know their unconventional path has value, even when others can't see it.